everybody. So we're just going to talk about the basics of INDs and IDEs and share some of our own experiences. Rob, I hope you'll come up and yeah. Oh, you can sit.
Slides first.
Okay. So yeah, my slides are very basic, just to make sure you kind of get a few of the kind of mechanics around doing INDs and IDEs. So disclosures. So for those who aren't familiar with the terminology, INDs refer to what you need to get to study a drug in a clinical trial. Investigational New Drug Application is what it stands for. And it's basically authorizing you from the FDA to give this investigational drug or biological product to a human. Whereas the IDE is the Investigational Device Exemption. And this allows the investigation device to be used in a clinical study to collect safety or effectiveness data for FDA clearance or approval of that device. FDA clearance being the 510K pathway and approval being the pre-market approval pathway. So there are two different branches of the FDA, depending on whether you're working with a drug or a device, CDER and CDRH. And so that's how it divides up. Yeah, and the biologics, I guess, are a third that aren't that I didn't put on this list. And then actually there's even like places, there's actually another branch involved with when you're combining device and drug into the same product. So that's something else to keep in mind. So have you used the biological branch for anything?
We haven't used the biological branch, so I don't have any experience with that. When combining, it's actually either one or the other, and they both get involved, and they decide whether you're going to proceed under an IND or an IDE, depending on who wants to take the lead. And then both centers are involved.
And I think there's a dedicated division, though, within one of them that kind of deals with the other. So I know this because we actually set up a pre-submission meeting and found out that we should have been in the combination section that we didn't know about. So
we've had two combinations.
Yeah.
I don't think we've gone to a separate.
Oh, okay.
So Rampart was done by drugs.
Yeah.
Even though it's also an auto-injector.
Okay.
It was done by the neurologic drugs division, and then. HOBIT is a hyperbaric chamber and oxygen. And oxygen, if you don't know, is a drug. And that we ended up also doing that under an NDA.
Okay, so they work it out between them. Okay, I didn't get that far, so that's good to know. Thanks. And so another thing I just wanted to get across is that you are the sponsor in this scenario. The sponsor is not the funding organization. It's you that is actually taking responsibility for initiating that clinical trial with that IND or IDE. And so when is an IND needed? Basically, when you're using an investigational drug of any sort, but you could also be using an approved drug and doing a new indication or population or a new dosage form or range that was not covered in the previous label. All of that would require an IND. To give you an example from, I did the PRISMS trial, which was alteplase for acute ischemic stroke. And actually it was sort of a debate about whether I needed an IND or not. So I submitted my IND application, and I initially got a letter back saying I didn't need IND because I wasn't planning to personally change the label. Well, our steering committee, as we sat there and talked about it, said we could imagine a scenario where the label would change and we'd want marketing to be able to happen. So we went back and said we want an IND. So we ended up getting an IND, and then I ended up getting it funded by industry. So then I gave them back my IND, and then the company got an IND. So just to give you a little bit of kind of how these things can play out. There are reasons that you might have an IND exemption, and that's that first reason that I just gave you. If you're really just working with the drug within its approval framework, and you're not intending to use it to support a change in advertising, that it doesn't involve a factor that's going to increase its use, and that you're going to do the usual things with IRB and comply with the requirements of a trial generally. Anything to add there, Rob?
So a lot of times you're going to end up wanting to ask, right? Because a lot of these things get fuzzy.
Very.
And you can ask for a pre-IND meeting, and one of the questions in the pre-IND meeting can be, do I need an IND for this or not? you will need to give them as much of your proposal as you can, because they're not going to give you anything in writing that says you can go ahead and do this if you haven't given them anything in writing that says what it is you want to do. The more you have written when you ask, the better, and the more specific your questions can be.
Yeah, and I guess I just reinforce that point, which is generally, if you're unsure, it's really worth reaching out because people are quite accessible and you can get information then from the people who will be ultimately making those decisions. So basically in your IND application, it's actually pretty straightforward. It's a lot of the things that you're putting together anyway to get your trial done, your protocol, your informed consent, draft CRAPS report forms maybe, certainly your CV, the investigator's brochure, labeling information if it's an approved drug, which is typically the investigator's brochure actually. So, and then a letter of authorization to cross-reference the company's product. And again, to give you my example, I have a letter from Genentech that they could look at, the details around the manufacturing chemical properties of Alteplase within their IND. And then relevant reference articles. So, I would include a couple articles that really kind of help frame the issue for the review panel. And so then the structure, so to give you a sense of what it looks like, you're literally putting together, there's a cover sheet that is a standard form, and then there are these three other standard forms, 1571, 1572, and 3674. 1571 is literally like, here's my name, here's, am I going to use EFIC or not, and the title, and a couple things like that, which, and then 1572 is all about the investigators. You'll always hear, was the investigator on the 1572? All investigators have to be on a 1572 in an IND trial, so you're sometimes revising your 1572 along the way. And then the 3674 is basically just, it's just signing off that you're going to follow the rules, so it's really just a signature type form. Anything to add there?
Yeah, so one of the things that's worth mentioning just as a concept of what 1572 is, so what the 1572 is the description of how you are delegating all responsibility for this trial to other people, right? So when you're the sponsor of an IND, the buck stops with you. All the regulations say the sponsor will do this, the sponsor will do this, the sponsor has the responsibility. You have all the responsibility for what happens in this trial when you're the sponsor of the IND. What these forms do is explain how you're delegating to different people with the proper training and resources, how they will do for you your responsibilities that you've delegated to them. So that's why the 1572 should be important, not just to FDA, but to you, because it's explaining how your responsibilities are turned out.
That's good point. And then when you end up having a little blurb, it's typically a few pages. The ones that I've been involved with are fairly simple. I don't know about you, Rob, an introductory statement and general investigational plan where you just kind of lay out in really clear English, here's what we know and here's what we don't know and here's why I'm doing this study and this is the study design. And then literally the investigator's brochure is that labeling, kind of that instruction that you can get with any drug. So you would just stick that in there for easy reference for them. And then the study protocol, the informed consent. And then typically, for most of you, you're then going to have that letter of authorization, which is going to refer to a previous company that's now creating this drug's IND application, which includes all the chemistry and the pharmacology and the previous human experience. And then you would throw some things in the appendix that you think would be useful for the FDA to see. And for me, it would be like a couple key papers in the example I was giving. Anything else to add there, Rob?
No, the CMC sections obviously become much bigger if you have a novel pharmaceutical that somebody is making for you to test. So if you're not using a commercial product, and this is all true if you're using a commercial product, if you're not using a commercial product, then you have to find a manufacturing facility that is a FDA approved GMP, good manufacturing practice facility to constitute this for you. And then there's a great deal of information that goes in the CMC that goes through all this clinical testing and all the purity testing and all of that. And that that would all be handled by whoever you hired to do your GMP, but it could be a big part of your IND.
I guess Dietrich also hit a little bit on some of that part of the application, so he'd probably be a good resource for that too, if you have questions. So they have a 30-day turnaround. No news is good news. It generally means that you're approved to go forward. You could theoretically get a clinical hold, and that happens for a few specific reasons, such as that they don't think the risk is justified by the potential benefit. They have some issues with the application. The investigators aren't qualified. Usually it's an issue with not having enough information in the application or a concern with a particular aspect. Anything there that you want to mention? Yeah. Okay. So, and then really it's back to, as you know, Rob was just saying, it really comes back to then it's your responsibility to keep up with these things. So after IRB approval, like sending your final protocol, every time you change your protocol, making sure you update the FDA, adding new investigators, always need that in 1572, any safety issues, basically serious and unexpected issues need to get in quickly within 15 days. Calendar days of getting the notification. Fatal or life-threatening suspected adverse events have to get in within 7 days, and those are quite strict. You have to do an annual report. When you're done with your study, you want to send a discontinued investigation report. You may need to withdraw your IND at some point. And I do recommend that you withdraw your IND because otherwise you technically have to send an annual report every year. So even if you're doing nothing, so save yourself that effort. And then financial disclosure reporting when you have any changes in your financial disclosures that are significant. So moving on to IDEs, I think the framework is very different there. There we're talking about a framework towards getting FDA clearance or approval for a device. And that framework is a bit, it has its own kind of lingo around it for those who aren't familiar. There's the 510K clearance pathway, and that's for low or moderate risk devices. And it's basically, a device can qualify for that if it's substantially equivalent to a device already on the market. So some of you, I may have been around back in the time with stroke. We had the Mercy Retriever, which was a device that could pull out clot, and it got 510K clearance because it worked substantially equivalently to a previous device that removed foreign bodies from the circulation. But then to get to take it to the next step of actually getting FDA approved, randomized trials had to happen, and that actually happened with newer generation devices that then got PMA to actually show that they make patients better. And so that was one of these unusual situations actually where it was first in 510K and then it was in PMA. Generally a high-risk device is going to go straight to the PMA pathway where you really have to show a clinical outcome as opposed to just the device says it does what it says it's going to do. And then the other pathway is the de novo petition where it's still a low or moderate risk device, but you don't have a predicate device, and it's a separate process where you basically end up asking to have it be considered in the 510K pathway. That's kind of the easiest way to explain that. So IDEs are needed for all significant risk devices. There are no pre-printed forms for the IDE, and you need to basically conceptually get across that the risks are outweighed by the benefits for the patients that will be in your trial, that the knowledge is important, that your study's sound, and that you have reason to believe your device will be effective. So for what is a significant risk device, I pulled this right off the FDA website. It's basically, they list these 4 categories. Implants, any device that's being used to support or sustain life, any device that's being used to substantially important for diagnosing, curing, mitigating, or treating disease, or preventing impairment of human health. And then really any device that presents a risk to health, safety, or welfare of a subject. So kind of fairly straightforward, I guess. You know, like latex gloves are an example of what class 1 would need an IDE for that. Anything to add there?
It often becomes not so clear. So, I mean, what about a app that helps you make a diagnosis? Put in information for an app and it gives you the diagnosis. Maybe. I mean, it's of substantial importance in diagnosing the disease.
Yeah.
So that, they get in EEG interpretation, generally a routine that helps an epileptologist see something better. An EEG reader, when they're reading it, wouldn't necessarily be a substantial change, but a thing that identifies seizures for an emergency physician who doesn't normally read EEGs would be a substantial importance of diagnosing. And so, the same routine, depending on how it's intended to be used, or who it's going to be used by, could or could not be required. So I think it can get pretty complicated.
Yeah, and the bottom line is, again, for this circumstance, talk to your regulatory officer early and start, discussing what you're going to be doing and getting a feel from them of what they think. So really, in the beginning, you make that initial risk determination, and then you actually talk with your IRB and submit your IRB application, and they may modify your decision. But the final arbiter and decision maker is the FDA. So you ultimately go to the FDA, and the FDA provides guidance to the sponsor and the IRB. I personally haven't done this from the beginning. Have you, with a device?
So yes, I haven't had this kind of problem, but I know who had. Will, you had a problem? Will here.
Will's gone.
Okay. A number of people had things that have gone through this process where they determined that it wasn't risk. They get to the IRB. The IRB said, "Oh yeah, this definitely needs FDA approval." And then they went to FDA, and FDA said, "No, you don't need to get out of here."
And I gotta say, yeah, in general, I can't tell you that there are clear patterns. I got this language again off the FDA website, and it really comes down to ask lots of questions and ask our colleagues who've been through this. I found that, things will actually change over time, frankly, depending on who you're talking to and who happens to be working there.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the things that we've shared last year, that a lot of people will say to you, the FDA will do this, the FDA is like this, the FDA, and what we found in both of our experiences, I think, is that the FDA isn't anything, right? I mean, there's no consistent, the FDA is always this, or the FDA is always this. The FDA is highly heterogeneous, and, one division isn't harmonized with the other division, and the people in enforcement are totally different from the people in review, and the thing that, so the things that were surprising is that despite all that, they're not terrible to work with, they're not great to work with, sometimes they're terrible to work with, and sometimes they're great to work with. But I think that our experience has mostly been that they're more accessible than a lot of other parts of the federal government, that they're open-minded to a rational argument. They are very, very focused on safety and making sure that nothing unsafe happens under their approval. But there's probably more innovation. They allow and promote innovation more than other research divisions within the federal government, I think. So talk to them and don't be sure about what FDA is going to do, because we're never sure about what FDA is going to do. More often than not, they come back with concern that is not the concern about their approval.
Yeah, that's true. I've seen people have to, have conference calls with their statisticians to justify the approach they used. So lots of back and forth can happen. But overall, the engagement, that application process is actually quite easy. So I do want to emphasize that. So I would get that out of the way early and start that dialogue early. And at this point, to apply, let's say you're doing an NIH application for a clinical trial, you actually have to have already applied for your IND or IDE at the time of submission. So it's good to get that ball rolling. IDE exemption criteria are basically those that are in accordance with the indication and labeling, non-invasive diagnostics, although it sounds like you just gave me an example, Rob, of a non-invasive diagnostic that did need an IDE, consumer preference testing, veterinary use, or lab animal research. So the IDE application, I personally haven't assembled one. Have you, Rob?
Yeah, we've done
Yeah.
one for IceCap.
Yeah, for IceCap. So maybe, so I'll just read through this and you can see if you have anything to add. But basically, it's just basic demographics, a report of the prior investigations of the device, your investigational plan, which I presume is basically your protocol, a description of your facilities and controls for manufacturing, et cetera, an investigational agreement, the names, sort of like the equivalent of your 1572 of your investigators that you're delegating to, IRB information, amount being charged for the device, and why it's not actually being commercialized, and basically why the sale does not constitute commercialization, labels, informed consent, and any other additional information you think they need.
And not just your device, but similar devices when you have prior experience. But again, it's, they're a lot of times they're going to be very focused on the engineering. So just like the CMC, if you don't have a cross-reference to another IDE, then you need to provide all the information about the engineering.
And my impression is the IDE application is less structured than the IND application. It's really, you just put it together in the format that you think is most useful. Yeah.
Which is really frustrating, actually.
Yeah, I can imagine. So I found this really useful because I actually, when we were preparing slides for this, I came across this nice chart. There's a nice paper in Neuron talking through device regulatory pathways, and I recommend it if anyone is doing a device study because, like I said, it's a little more, it's more nuanced than a drug from my perspective pathway. But they're basically branches: the neurodiagnostic and neurosurgical devices, neurointerventional, neurostimulation, neurology, neurostimulation, psychiatry, and PM&R. So I think it's helpful to see what kinds of devices are in this list, and so you'll have this slide as a reference if your device happens to fall in them, and then the contact person would be the person within that branch that you would want to reach out to. And then very similar responsibilities that you have for an IDE in terms of all the things that I mentioned with the IDE, keeping them up to speed when you have protocol changes, investigator changes, annual reports, etc. So I would strongly encourage you to just follow the FDA website carefully. It's fairly clear in terms of what components you need for your application. And then there's also a very nice slide set out of the University of Michigan that could be a good reference to you, called the IND IDE Assistance Program, MIAP. So, any other things, take-home points that you would add, Rob?
No, I mean it's a learning exercise as you go on. We've only done, between us only a few, but talk to them often. They'll tell you, but they'll answer the phone. They won't put things in writing nearly as often as they'll tell you. They'll give you advice, but they'll be much less willing to put things in writing. So when you want things in writing, you have to send them things in writing, and you have to be very specific, and they'll be very specific back to you.
That's a really great point. Yeah, I just want to reinforce that point, which is that, if you're somebody who's, a little intimidated by contacting the FDA, and so you want to write this formal email and set up an appointment, that's exactly not going to get you as much information, because those conversations you have are much more helpful. So maybe we can open it up for any questions. If any of you are applying for INDs or IDEs, have anything on your mind? Yes, I saw you. Oh, go ahead. You and then you.
So as far as IRP and myself in agreement, I don't need to worry about it.
If you and the IRB think that you don't need an IND, then you would actually still go in with the application and you get documentation of your IND exemption from now the FDA could say they don't agree with you, and in the end you'd listen to what the FDA says. So you still want to put in that application and get that exemption letter.
I guess it depends on how marginal you're talking about, right? I mean, so if you get a CT and you read the CT, you're not investigating the CT. Obviously, you use FDA-approved devices all the time, right? So So it's a question of whether the device is the investigational component or not. And then the question is, are you using it in exactly the way that it's labeled or not?
But I would say though that, you know, for NIH applications, you need some sort of documentation. So it's kind of harder to get out of getting that exemption letter. It might be for
I'm just
others,
saying it depends on how obvious
pathways.
it is.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, it could be so obvious that, but I mean, a very low threshold for getting FDA for sending a proposal to them and saying, you know, we have a question for you before submission. Our question for you is, since we're using a pre-approved, already approved device in its intended manner, does this really need an IDE? And they'll say, no, we think we were using the device as it was intended to be used for years.
Yeah. And I think you were next, yeah.
So if you previously had an IND exemption, how often do you have to do that for every protocol that you are submitting? So you're carrying this through, some intervention through all the phases. So do you have to do it for every time you come up with a new protocol? Can you clarify a little bit about this pre-IND meeting and what kind of documentation you receive back from that? And then if you do have to go for a full IND, how do you engage the previous IND holder to get them to be willing to say, yeah, you can look at my IND, if they're not involved in the study? So, I mean, you with Genentech, they had an invested interest in saying, yeah, but if you're not engaging them, what's to prevent them from saying no?
It could theoretically happen, and that could be an issue. I haven't seen that happen with any of the trials I've been involved with where the company wouldn't release that information. Have you, Rob?
We haven't run into that, but I mean, I know that happens, right? I mean, if you want to do an investigation that the company thinks is not in their interest, then they've got no reason to give you permission to cross-reference their existing IND or their master drug file. So you could have a problem if you want to do an investigational, if you want to use somebody else's drug in an investigational manner to study something that they think you shouldn't. You might not be able to. Unless you
Thankfully, I can't think of an example of that recently, so.
The pre-IND meeting with
Pre-IND meeting. Yeah, so I know you can actually kind of send a formal list of questions and put in a request for a meeting, but you can also do those informal things where you pick up the phone.
Yeah, so it varies. I think it depends on what you want to get out of it, and we've had different responses at different times from different people. So usually you can call up somebody and say, I have a pre-IND question, and if you don't need it in writing and you just want advice, they may provide it, let's just have a casual conversation on the phone with you, and that works fine. If you want a letter back saying this isn't going to need an IDE or an IND, then you're going to have to send them a formal request for a pre-IND meeting. And that request, what they're going to want in that request is as much detail about the protocol as you can provide them. And
It's the FDA problem.
and they're going to want to know the specific questions you want answered. And at that point, they might get back to you and say, great, we're going to schedule a phone call as you requested, or they might get back to you and say, we think that this isn't best handled with a phone call. We're going to send you back an email that answers your questions, and then you can ask for a phone call if the email doesn't answer your questions satisfactorily. And there's a timeline on those too, and I don't remember what the timeline is.
I'll give you a couple examples from this year that I had. One was with a drug, a novel drug, and we basically asked for an IND meeting, pre-IND meeting, and we gave a list of questions that we'd like addressed. The advantage of the in-person meeting is you actually get the full panel. You get a nice broad representation as opposed to that one-on-one. So if you have something controversial, that's where you probably want that in-person meeting more. And actually, the reply that we got back was, here's the answers to your questions. We don't think you need to meet us. So that can happen too. So I want to tell you that. And then the second one was, we wanted to make sure with a novel device that we were actually going to be using the right pathway, and that the trial we were designing was going to allow that device to get the appropriate clearance or approval. And there, that in-person was great, and they really kind of looked at our design and talked through with us what it will and will not achieve within the drug device branch. So I hope those examples help.
And then there was a first question actually that you asked, which is, does every protocol need a new application? And the answer is usually not. So an IND, both an IND or a IDE can have numerous protocols under it. So if you do, and so example, when a drug company opens up an IND, but then you die.
Cutting you off.
So you can have one IND, and you can keep adding protocols to it unless there's some bizarre things.